Religion and class have always been intertwined in American life. MacLeod and Merola show that even within congregations, class differences shape music, architecture, and sermons. Karl Marx saw religion as a tool to keep workers docile, while Max Weber argued that Protestant beliefs, especially Calvinism, help justify wealth as a sign of God's favor. This means that religion doesn't just reflect class, but it also helps create and defend it. Sheila Collins explains how these ideas grew into a national myth of American exceptionalism, the belief that we're a classless society where anyone can rise through hard work. Puritan theology presented inequality as divinely ordained. Some must be rich, others poor, for the good of the whole. That story became part of our political culture, shaping everything from the Founding Fathers to Reagan's city on a hill rhetoric. But this myth masks how deep inequality and class immobility really are. The social gospel movement was one of the first major attempts to use Christianity to challenge these inequalities. Leaders like Walter R. taught that faith should transform society itself, not just save individual souls. According to the ARC magazine article, this was the beginning of the American religious left, connecting faith to economic and racial justice. Even so, the movement mainly called for reform within capitalism rather than its overthrow. These readings show that religion can both reproduce and resist class structures. Churches often mirror the economic segregation of society, but they can also mobilize for change, like the social gospel or the civil rights era. Yet the media today often frames religious activism as a moral issue instead of a class one, keeping the myth alive.
What is the Poor People's Campaign? One of the biggest events we see in the modern day relating social class explicitly to religion is the revival of the Poor People's Campaign, originally spearheaded by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 to unite poor Americans across racial lines and demand economic justice. In 2018, Reverend Barber and Theo Harris relaunched it as the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. It has held marches, civil disobedience actions, and national moral assemblies, most recently in 2024, calling attention to low wages, housing insecurity, healthcare inequality, and voter suppression affecting low-income communities. How does this event connect to our readings? This event connects in two major ways. The first is through the Black social gospel. First, the social gospel movement showed one of the earliest examples of religion creating class solidarity rather than simply reinforcing inequality. Before this movement, many Protestant churches were either indifferent to the suffering of industrial workers or only offered limited charity, often distinguishing between the deserving and undeserving poor. The social gospel challenged that mindset by insisting that Christianity had to address the harsh realities of urban poverty, exploitations of laborers and immigrants, racism, and even militarism. This movement pushed for concrete reforms through what became known as the Social Creed, which called for limits on Sunday working hours, the abolition of child labor, a livable wage, and early forms of social welfare. In other words, it shifted religion away from charity alone and towards systemic change. However, much of the early social gospel was led by white clergy members and focused on reforming society without fundamentally challenging racial hierarchies. This is where the Black social gospel becomes essential. Black religious leaders emphasized liberation from both racial and economic oppression. They argued that faith required not just improving conditions within the system, but transforming the system itself so that all people could live with dignity. The modern Poor People's Campaign continues directly in the Black social gospel tradition. It treats poverty as a structural and moral crisis, not an individual failing, and calls for deep changes to the system that harms the poor. The second concept is Neuber's cycle of religion and class. He described how religious groups form to serve the needs of the poor, but often drift upwards socially and stop serving them. The Poor People's Campaign is a response to that cycle. It's intentionally outside of wealthy church structures and recenters religion on the people who feel neglected by mainstream churches.
Sociologically, the relaunched Poor People's Campaign challenges class structures rather than reproducing them. Historically, American religion has often upheld a meritocratic worldview where economic success was seen as evidence of moral strength and divine blessing, while poverty reflected a lack of discipline or faith. Though just as meritocracy is in some ways preached but not practiced in capitalism, some facets of merit in religious history have been, as Michael Sandel would put it, not an alternative to inequality, but instead the justification for it. As Sheila Collins notes, the belief in meritocracy, rooted in Puritan ideals and reinforced through Protestant ethics, prevented Americans from recognizing structural barriers that transformed class inequality into a moral hierarchy, allowing wealth to appear deserved and poverty to seem justified. The Poor People's Campaign directly resists that tradition. It reframes poverty not as an individual moral failure, but as collective social injustice, calling attention to the economic, racial, and political systemic forces that shape people's lives. This campaign also seeks to address some major ideological blind spots, such as American exceptionalism, where many Americans still believe the U.S. is a classless society with limitless mobility. The campaign directly disrupts that myth by showing how deeply class inequality affects people of all races. And it also addresses that religion is inherently conservative, where many people assume that when religion is involved in politics, it is automatically conservative. The Poor People's Campaign challenges that by showing a religious movement rooted in justice for the poor. And then it also addresses charity versus structural change, where public discourse often expects churches to help the poor through charity, not activism. This campaign rejects charity as a band-aid solution and calls for systemic reforms, which can make some religious and political leaders uncomfortable. From a sociological perspective, the Poor People's Campaign is important because it tries to reclaim religion as a tool for collective empowerment, rather than comfort or control. It disputes the long-standing pattern where religion eased suffering but left systems untouched. Instead, it tries to transform the system itself. Instead of rising socially and abandoning the poor, the movement insists that faith must stay rooted in the material conditions of people who are suffering. And when looking at how the Poor People's Campaign is covered in the media, we notice that it receives far less attention compared to religious movements focused on culture war issues. When religion appears in headlines, it's usually about the same hotbutton topics like abortion, the LGBTQ plus community, or church scandals, things like that, not poverty, wages, or healthcare. This tells us that the media does not treat class as a religious issue, even when faith leaders repeatedly do. By ignoring religious activism around class, media coverage reinforces the idea that poverty is a personal or political issue, not a moral one. And for our discussion question, we ask, does religion in America in any way still exist to justify inequality under the myth of meritocracy?